Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 was a flawed game that I really rather enjoyed. Clunky yet decently fun combat, a solid story if not slightly predictable with its plot twist. Radzig!
In the misty mountainside, he's got shiny diamonds that he's got to protect. Look into the
Radzig!
eye, then you know that
Radzig!
fly.
Radzig!
He's my daddy and he's going to protect me.
I really hope enough people get the reference because that took me way too long to edit. For transparency's sake, I was given a review copy of the game. There will be 0 spoilers for this game's story. I spent 90 something hours in the game, though I could say that if you're really only focused on the main story, plus a decent amount of side stuff, you're looking at likely 50 to 60 hours. I also played the game on a high-end PC. Today, we're gonna judge the second game based on its story, combat, stealth, graphics, bugs, crashes, and optimization, minigames, romances, and whatever else I could think of at the end. As I mentioned previously, I really enjoyed the story of the first game. Let's call it a 7 out of 10. Strictly main story speaking, this game's story is a 10 out of 10. I was so obsessed with it. It's exactly what I was hoping for and went so much further. Smart writing, interesting subplots, great new and old characters, much improved voice acting everywhere. If the first game had a plot twist that was obvious, then this game was for sure throwing some curveballs at me. Avoiding spoilers, you and Hans continue from the end of the first game delivering a message. Things don't go as planned, and you're quickly thrown into the chaos of the conflict in the land. The story does a great job of making both you and Hans feel like fishes out of water being in said new land. I always know a story is amazing when I have this gut punch feeling at the end when it's over, and that certainly happened here. I was hoping for a bit more from the side missions. So the game has 2 maps, one that's a slightly smaller sort of tutorial area, and then a much bigger second level map thing.
Anyway, you need people of intelligence on this sort of mission. Quest. Thank you.
Overall, I would say that there are better individual side missions in this game compared to the first. Hell, all the good ones exceed any of the side missions from the first. It's just there's so many filler side missions, especially in that first map I mentioned. I only really liked, say, 25% of the side quests, like the ones that really stood out. With that being said, there was 4 side missions I could not do. So let this be a warning of sorts. Throughout the game, there are points of no return, and because of one of these, I couldn't access those side missions. And trust me, you'll know when it is. So just in case of emergency, do those side missions. I let the devs know about this and they're aware. I just don't know if it's gonna be fixed before day 1. If you enjoyed the humor of the first game, I think you'll be very pleased with this one. They cranked it up a certain amount, and I think it all hits very well as far as the humor and jokes. I've heard that there are multiple endings to the game. I'm not sure how much weight I put into that. There are certainly choices in the game. I would personally compare it to Telltale Walking Dead. While choices do affect portions of the story, my prediction is the overall story arc doesn't really change. That's at least from my perspective, and I could be very wrong about that. But what I can say for certain is these choices that you make, I think there's enough of them to make me want to do a second playthrough relatively quickly too. Events at the start of the game explain why Henry starts off not at max level. Instead of starting at the max level of 20 from the first game, you lose a certain amount of levels. This is just enough to where you are still skilled but aren't the maxed out Giga Chad you were in the first. Combat feels a lot smoother this time around, but I feel like this is unfortunately at the cost of difficulty. You won't notice it within the first 5 to 10 hours. I didn't notice. I understand that you want it to be more consumable from a mainstream perspective, but I have to wonder if they overdid it. I very rarely died in combat in this game. Keep in mind, I'm the mindless dweeb that still can't figure out combos and the Master Strike. Maybe I'm just getting too old for the reaction time. However, I think this kind of further drives my point about how easier the game is. In the first game, I didn't understand these things either, and I rightfully had a hard time for most of the game. Even then, I pushed myself to max out skills and practice what I could digest in order to get as good as I could. With all that being said, I'm not the kind of guy to play Souls-likes. I've never been one to care to try hard. And despite it being a lot easier this time around, the combat is still really fun. And it's a lot smoother and feels less clunky. It actually feels like you're dancing, baby. Who knows, maybe the game is still really challenging and it turns out I'm just that good and now I am the king of the nerds.
That's improbable. but not impossible.
I know that post-launch there's a hardcore mode coming, and maybe on a second playthrough, that'll give me the challenge I want. Yet I also figure I'll probably find that too challenging and wish there was more of a happy middle ground. Now, I'm officially done complaining about how easy the game is. All the weapon types from the first game return. I think something that's gonna make a lot of people happy is that pole arms this time around can actually be in your inventory without cheesing like the first game. In fact, I actually used them once I hit post game and was just messing around, and they were pretty fun. I did feel, as far as the melee weapons go, a small sense of difference in feel between the major types of weapons: axes, maces, swords, etc. It's a nice change of pace between your various options. Now, I mentioned how the weapons feel, and I do think it's an improvement over the first game. The crossbow they introduce is a lot of fun to use, but I found myself rarely using it because there just weren't enough situations to warrant it. They also introduced a pistol that I honestly wasn't a big fan of. It does a lot of damage, sure, but the load time for it is so agonizingly long, I just didn't bother, which of course, that's how it should be. Yet if I didn't feel the need to use the crossbow, which takes a little bit of time to load, then why would I feel the need to use this kind of logic? I'm happy it's there for more weapon variety, and I'm sure some of you will love using it, but it just wasn't my cup of tea. Now, there are battles in the game where you do use ranged weapons for a small extent of time. I just wish there was more of that, especially outside of the main story stuff. We gotta do Poppy, which admittedly has absolutely nothing to do with this video, but I'm just really excited. Though, to be fair, Henry has a puppy. So if you think about it, I'm kind of like Henry. Actually, it's kind of funny if you think about it, because if her fur was a bit more of a darker brown, she would look pretty similar to Mutt. So yes, Henry's dog Mutt does make a return from the first game in its DLC. Much like the first, he can be used to help you in combat. This will help even the odds, though it was another feature after the halfway point of the game I stopped using completely. Something definitely for players to use that might be struggling to help them along their entire game. I did have some people ask me during my preview content of the game if it's required to use Mutt, even if you even have to have him with you. You will eventually hit a point where you can leave him somewhere and get him back when you deem necessary. Now, what's funny for me is I always had him with me, and I loved having him because it was, you know, it's your little buddy, right? There's horse combat, and I only know about this because of the skill tree, which I'll get into later. I never felt the need to try it, and honestly, throughout the entire game, there's nothing that even hints that you should try it. There are a good bit more battles in this game, and I really loved all of them. This is where I actually felt the slightest bit of difficulty because of how many enemy soldiers routinely and obviously had armor on. There's so much about the game I can't talk about when it comes to the bosses, and that's strictly because the publisher said no with the NDA. So what I can say is, and I know I said I was not going to make this statement again, the bosses were super duper easy. But I feel like I have to bring this up because I feel like it was the most egregious part of the game that was too easy. Like, ignore everything else I said. I feel like the bosses are, because of that, horrifically disappointing. Stealth, I thought, was pretty decently improved from the first game. You better hope it is decently improved, because there's a good bit of stealth sections in the main story. Luckily, out of all the ones I experienced, only one really infuriated me. I'm hopeful it's something the devs fix because, again, NDA. I'll just say it felt like in the mission area, there were way too many NPCs walking around, and I had to cheese just to make my way through. All the other stealth sections were fine. As someone that hates stealth in every game that's ever had it, it's fine. I have no complaints there. I routinely just stripped down to my medieval boxers whenever it was stealth time and utilized the ability to throw rocks to distract enemies and get them to move. Though there was one section where there was one singular guard in a main story section that would not move when I was throwing a rock, unless I threw it at exactly the right section of the lower part of a single wall the guard happened to be next to, which was pretty annoying and for sure a bug. I let the devs know, so hopefully you don't experience this. It was also the only time this bug occurred, but since it was experienced during a main story mission, I feel like I'm obligated to mention it. Finally, when it comes to the stealth section of this video, I'm going to mention the fact that I noticed the fail rate of attempted stealth kills felt a bit too high, even when max leveled, so I'm hopeful that's something they'll address. Hi. So during the recording of this, me and my wife both got food poisoning, so if I seem a bit less energized, forgive me. Also, if the second or last portions of this video are a bit condensed, forgive me as well. Luckily, most of these portions were meant to be a bit shorter because I didn't have as much to say, so it kind of worked out for me. So thank you for understanding. Also, while I have you guys, the video for my unboxing of the collector's edition for this game should be live, so make sure to go watch that, please. Graphically, the game is a pretty good improvement, going from CryEngine 3 to 5. Say the graphics of the first game are a 6. I think this one is definitely an 8 at least. The biggest graphical improvement in my eyes were the character models outside of cutscenes. They look a lot better, I think. Cutscenes are just gorgeous, a huge improvement. Because the cutscenes look so good and because the character models look so much better, I feel like the transition from the normal cutscene to the typical dialogue is a much easier transition. Especially after the first game's launch, I'm very happy to report that I didn't have a single crash my entire playthrough. The only thing that remotely happened to me was me trying to save and sleep, and Henry just kind of stopped and stood there. I suppose you could definitely count that as a crash, though I was able to access the menu and load up a previous save on the spot. I also was in contact with the QA team about this. They asked me for my save file, and then also asked me which bed it was exactly, which seems pretty reassuring that they're going to be on top of that before day one. It's worth mentioning that this crash, we'll call it a crash, right? At the end of the day, only occurred one time. I also stress test it in a sense to see if that same bed would do the same thing, and it never did, which is a good bit reassuring. Finally, I want to say that, or I'd rather, I'm too sick for this.
Miss Dawson, my tummy hurts.
Okay, why don't you just lay back and relax?
I've got too much doo-doo in my underpants. Make the stinky go away.
I want to give a big shout out to the QA team. I probably sent them 15 to 20 emails reporting small little bugs, mostly visual. And every time the person who I was in constant contact with was very nice and allowed me to bug them, so to speak. It'll be really cool in my second playthrough after the day one patch to see if any of the bugs I wrote down are no longer there, because then I could be like, I helped, and that'd be really cool. I didn't notice any major FPS drops, but again, old man Bargain probably doesn't see that good anymore. The skill tree is a vast improvement. For the most part, I was very happy with every skill I got. There were certainly filler ones for me, but they might appeal to other players for all I know. The first game's skill tree constantly had this thing of, well, I'll improve in this, but it'll be worse than this. That's gone now. I think it's a very welcome change too. From here, we're gonna go into what I'm gonna refer to as mini games. With lockpicking, I'd say it feels the slightest bit easier on controller, which is nice. I think if you hated the lockpicking from the first game, you still will. If you were a fan of it, it should still be the same sentiment here. I can safely say if you get your skill up high enough, the lockpicking even on the hardest locks gets very, very manageable. Now let's talk about pickpocketing. It's literally just the same. Not a bad thing, just that's all I gotta say about it. With the alchemy bench, I'm pleased they did a really good tutorial for this in the game. I struggled a bit in the first until a few practices and YouTube videos. I needed a serious refresher and got one very quickly with the tutorial. However, while I do enjoy this minigame, it quickly just becomes not useful. Much like the first game, you just make so much money at a certain point. It's quicker and easier to just simply buy the potions. Still good for RP though, if that's your thing. The big contributing factor to this, I would say, is probably the big city in the game, because there's so many vendors with that alone, not to mention the various ones in the outlying towns, you can quickly spam buying whatever potions you need, including the save potion. The blacksmithing feature gels so incredibly well with the rest of the game that during my preview content, I said it was in the first game. An obvious mistake when it was pointed out to me. I mentioned this as an indication of how much I enjoyed it and how well it fit. While it still becomes slightly obsolete outside of RP due to the previously mentioned issue of just getting so much money quickly through being a loot goblin in all the missions themselves, it's required for a couple of the missions that add a lot to the situations at hand. And the weapon that I found to have the most damage in the entire game was made via blacksmithing. I won't say the weapon name or even the type of weapon for obvious reasons, but I will say that I didn't get it from the main story. The dice minigame makes its return. I played a few times, still okay. I wasn't super into it the first game. Anything they added to add some variety didn't really hold my interest. So when it comes to the hunting, I only did it in the first game when it forced me to do so with Hans. I didn't even remotely try to do it this game. The grindstone is the same, though it seems like it's a lot easier this time around. You said you wouldn't say something was a lot easier, bargain. To begin the romance section of this video, I will not be saying whether or not Teresa is in the game, partially due to an NDA, but also because I wouldn't want to spoil it for you guys. So, how are the romances in the game? There are certainly more than the first. However, I just didn't really vibe with most of them. I think I only really gravitated towards one, and even that didn't give me the same feeling that Teresa did in the first in regard to being like, this is perfect. Also, a couple of the romances just didn't make sense to me as far as Henry and felt borderline forced. With all that being said, it's an RPG. I think that the personalities of all the different romance options are vastly different, and I think everyone will gravitate to certain ones based on the individual player's personality, which is great.
Bull testicles, fresh bull testicles, delicious bull testicles.
So here's my final verdict. I'm honestly stuck somewhere between an 8 and a 9. A quick overview. Combat feels a lot better, yet goes a bit too much into easier territory because of it. An amazing story, but a lot of lackluster side quests. Fantastic characters, voice acting, and humor. RP elements that I liked, but ultimately deemed unnecessary a lot of the time, if not most of the time. I think because of the lack of execution at times, it keeps it away from being a perfect game. I for sure think it's worth full price. So yeah, I think I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. As someone that doesn't typically replay games unless a large amount of time has passed, I think I'll do a second playthrough sooner than later because I want to see what I can do to change subplots in the story based on choices and see if it changes the overall outcome of the game significantly. I suppose in a sense, that's where the easier combat will be a welcome thing. I hope you enjoyed watching this. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you're new. Again, I hope this turned out okay considering how I was sick most of the time. Once more, make sure to go check out my unboxing of the collector's edition if you haven't yet. Check out my series I've started where I review movie license titles. We've got a lot of cool ones coming up. I'm also trying to decide how I'm going to revisit reviews. For example, my first review I did on here was Indiana Jones, and I think I only gave that a 7 out of 10 because I was pretty harsh on the combat. But after doing a second playthrough, I would definitely go back and give it a 9. I definitely liked the combat a bit more this time around, and I think because everything else was super duper good, I think in that case, I can change it to a 9. How I'm going to do that overall, I don't know. I might do a follow-up video. And finally, if you want to see me do a spoiler video where I talk about the events of the game, let me know in the comments, please. Thank you so much for watching, and see you later.